So I'm going to get started. And first off, just thank you so much. And wanted to tell you a little bit about the Ocean Plastics Leadership Network, just to root you in who we are and how we work. We are a neutral convener that really believes in the experiential element of this crisis and all the world's crisis. Like, it's really important to go see the effect of this plastic crisis globally. And we actually got our start in the middle of the Atlantic Gyre, one of the 5 gyres, the Atlantic Garbage Patch, where we took 165 executives. We had members from the Break Free from Plastic movement and members from the petrochemical sector on that ship in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle. And so we have been convening neutrally since our inception, and moving into what we've built with respect to treaty and intervention and stakeholder engagement. For the last 2.5 years, we have been working with the World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace to tell the story of what this treaty could be and to educate broadly. And we're so grateful to the opportunity to continue that today. And then we also do stakeholder sentiment and capacity building to help surface alignment across this complicated ecosystem. So, really, to sum up who we are, we're a neutral convener, we're an educator, and we're dedicated to building capacity for intervention on behalf of the plastics crisis. So again, in March 2021, working with the World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace, we developed this program called the Global Treaty Dialogues, which has been going on for a very long time. And as a result of these global meetings, we've actually begun working in countries, and with many of the countries represented on this phone today. We've done meetings and convenings in Chile and Malaysia. We've done a big stakeholder forum in the United States ahead of UNEA 5.2. We've worked in Pakistan, in Ghana, in Indonesia, and then most recently before INC1, and we'll talk a little bit about this with the United Kingdom government. We've done 18 dialogue sessions. We've had over 1,000 activist and industry participants, and we've worked in 50 countries worldwide. I want to take a moment to thank our supporting partner for this specific Global Treaty Dialogue today, and that's SAP. SAP Responsible Design and Production will help businesses navigate new regulations, standardize the approach to material measurement, support design processes that enable innovation, and unlock solutions that will be sustainable for the long term. I also want a quick disclaimer: supporting partners do not influence the Global Treaty Dialogue's programming, considerations, agenda, or participation framework at all. But we're very, very grateful for the support and partnership with SAP to help make this possible. And now I'm going to turn it over to my partner at the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network, Marta Lopata.
Hi, everyone. So great to see you all here today. As we're still admitting everybody in the room, I see over 100 of you already have joined. We're going to just quickly get started here, rehashing on why we're here to start with. So we have the mandate to start negotiations. The 5th UN Environment Assembly on March 2nd, 2022, member states agreed to start negotiation on a global plastic treaty that will be legally binding, considering the full life cycle of plastics, promote sustainable production of plastics, acknowledge plastics' potential risk to humans' health, and recognize the role of waste pickers and informal waste sector in solving the plastic crisis problem. Next slide, please. Right now, you're looking at our plastics treaty roadmap. We will be on this journey with you throughout. And as of right now, we're looking at a journey of this INCs over the course of the next 2.5 years, with our webinars being a part of it pre and post each INC. So today on December 12th, we're here specifically to share with you key ideas and key considerations from the INC1 that took place in Uruguay starting November 28th in Punte del Este. I've seen many of you there, and we're excited to share what we have all learned during today's session. Next slide. And our Global Tree Dialogues are prioritizing bringing together all the stakeholders involved in the plastic crisis to the table. So bringing together this agenda, we've been paying attention to make sure we extend our invitation to all of you across research academia, activists, civil society, waste management, informal waste sector, manufacturer producers, agriculture, consumer goods, small local businesses, and many more. Thank you all for joining us today, and we're hoping that this session will be a helpful educational component of this process. And on that note, we're very honored to welcome our first speaker today. Next slide, please. Gustavo Meza-Cuadra, Ambassador of Peru and INC Chair. Welcome, Gustavo. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start with your opening statements.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martha. Thank you very much to the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network for organizing this meeting just a few days after the first meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop what will likely be the most important international treaty in recent years with the goal of end plastic pollution on our planet. The last meeting in Punte del Este, Uruguay, gathered over 2,500 participants and representatives from more than 150 countries. There was also a multi-stakeholder forum, regional consultations, and substantive discussions on the key elements for the future treaty. We have discussed different aspects of what we want the future instrument to be, as well as the process to get there and the involvement of relevant stakeholders. It has been important to listen to different stakeholders, get their inputs, as well to continue to improve the stakeholder engagement process to achieve a truly inclusive and stakeholders-informed process. The INC1 has been unique in several ways, not the least of which is the large participation of small islands. As chair, I look forward to encouraging broad and inclusive participation in this process to ensure that our negotiations remain transparent, inclusive, and informed by experts from all sectors, including business, academia, NGOs, etc. I am aware that these negotiations will be complex, at times technical, and difficult to find common ground. However, to listen to so many countries championing an ambitious treaty to end plastic pollution from the beginning of this negotiating process fills me with optimism and hope that we will achieve our goal to improve the environment and planetary health. UNEA Resolution 514 entitled Ending Plastic Pollution Towards an International Legally Binding Instrument, which created the legal framework that has guided our efforts as participants in this first INC meeting, mandated us to work toward an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including the marine environment, that addresses the full life cycle of plastics. I want to reiterate that this is not an easy task, but the right thing to do is hardly ever easy to implement. To accomplish our mandate, we must remain patient and committed to our goals, and not to lose sight of our overall objective, ending plastic pollution. It is important to take a step back and truly recognize the progress that has been accomplished. As alluded previously, during INC1, delegates discussed the objectives, scope, fundamental elements of the future treaty, binding and voluntary measures, scientific and technical cooperation, research, awareness raising, and the stakeholder engagement. One of the main outcomes of the INC1 is that it tasked the Secretariat with developing a document for INC2 that includes proposed elements for international legally binding instrument based on a comprehensive approach that addresses the full life cycle of plastic, that identifies the objectives, substantive provisions including core obligation, control measures and voluntary approach, implementation measures and means of implementation. This document could include both legally binding and voluntary measures. The document to be prepared by the Secretariat will be the basis for the substantive discussion at INC2, and the Secretariat has requested written inputs from member states and stakeholders. The committee decided that the second session of the INC will be held in Paris, France. It is tentatively set for the week of the 22 May 2023. We look forward to continuing our collaboration with all of you in the lead up to INC2. Distinguished guests, I would also like to thank the active engagement of non-state actors such as civil society, private sector, academia, waste speaker, among others, which will be crucial for the success of the process. All relevant stakeholders must be heard and must join forces to identify and adopt concrete measures to reduce the production of virgin plastic, establish measures to eliminate single-use plastic, as well as the use of certain substances harmful to human health and the environment, promote recycling and ensure the safe and proper disposal of existing plastic waste, especially in the marine environment. I would like to thank again the organizers for the invitation to this event. I trust that the fruitful discussion will be valuable contribution for the INC process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. And we're gonna now move to our second statement from the UNEP team. And we're gonna bring forward Brenda Koak, UNEP Program Manager at the Circle of Excellence on Plastic Pollution. Welcome, Brenda.
Great, great, thank you very much. And thanks to the Oceans Plastic Leadership Network for organizing the session today. I think it's really promising when we see such a diverse group of stakeholders together discussing, brainstorming, and bringing thoughts together to help us all move forward. Our Executive Secretary, Joyty Matur-Philippe, sent along her regrets for the session today, and she wasn't able to make it. So, but she's happy to hear back on the session from me today. So as Ambassador Meza Kudra mentioned, there were over 2,500 participants in Punta, or 2,500 participants total, 1,100 present in Punta. This was really the chance for a first full dialogue on our session, and it was a really important opportunity, and I think it set a very positive tone for the negotiations ahead. There was an opportunity for stakeholder dialogue and the multi-stakeholder forum, which also brought many voices to the discussion on key topics. For those of you that aren't familiar, the Earth Negotiations Bulletin provided a full coverage of our meeting, and I will drop the link of that into the chat for those of you who are interested in receiving the detailed elements of what was discussed. Ambassador also mentioned that the Secretariat was requested to prepare a document with potential options for future elements towards the international agreement. And this is a really important element where we are seeking inputs from all. That was a part of the request in order to develop it. So we will be basing this on what we heard at the INC itself, but also from inputs from stakeholders and member states. And we have sent out a request. A formal notification was sent out on Friday for submissions to us. For observers, the deadline for such submissions are the 6th of January, and for member states, the deadline for such submissions are the 10th of February. And the reason for these two different deadlines is that the intention, of course, is that the observers being able to submit their submissions ahead of time is that the member states can actually consider these submissions as they develop theirs, and it's quite an innovative element into this model. So please be considering this as you move forward. The Secretariat is developing and finalizing a template for these submissions, and that will come forward to you this week. So please be aware that the template is coming, but we wanted to send the submission deadlines as soon as possible so that you could be ready to submit them. I just also wanted to highlight that the INC did agree to 2 work streams in moving forward through the discussions, and these work streams include one on substantive elements, so in particular objectives, scope, core obligations, and control measures, and the second on implementation elements, so in particular the means of implementation and financing, institutional arrangements, assessment of progress and implementation, as well as stakeholder engagement. So I think those are really helpful 2 streams for us to be considering as we work through our planning as we move forward. Finally, INC2, it is agreed it will be held in Paris. The tentative date is the week of the 22nd of May. I do note that it is tentative. We will be confirming these dates in due course as soon as we know, but please be planning on Paris in May 2022. 2023, sorry, the week of 22 May. Anyway, we wish to thank everybody for their contributions at INC1. It was a heavy meeting and an exciting place to be in Latin America, a really positive place in starting these negotiations. And I really look to you as our stakeholders in the process, as our governments, that we have a really great opportunity here to move forward and really make a difference. And we really hope that you can use this momentum that's been generated over the last year through the UNEA resolution and this first negotiation session to come up with an ambitious result as we move forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And now we're moving to our first capacity building INC1 recap session of the day, hosted and presented by Christina Dixon from Environmental Investigation Agency. Welcome, Chris, and I'm going to hand it over to you from here.
Hi there, thank you, and hope everyone can hear me okay. So yeah, I was tasked with doing a sort of 10-minute download on what happened at INC1. It was a pretty crazy week, so I'm going to try my best to condense this in an accessible and informative way. And I'm putting on not a neutral hat, but more like a neutral blanket because it's like -2 and snowing. But yeah, so this is going to be a neutral sort of impartial debrief on what happened. And I can always answer questions in the chat afterwards if anything is unclear. So I think sort of key things to think about in terms of how this week went. A lot happened, but I think from my perspective, one of the most interesting things was the sort of evolution of the narrative. So, you know, we heard that we got the mandate from UNEA back in March, but it's pretty top line. But throughout the week, during the interventions from member states, we heard a lot more, for example, on the issue of health, chemicals. We also had the High Commissioner on Human Rights from the UN talk about the relationship between the Plastics Treaty and human rights. We had the UN Secretary General talking about the relationship between the Plastics Treaty and fossil fuels. I've just snipped from Twitter 2 of those statements if you want any more context on that. But it's really clear that our understanding of the issue of plastic pollution has evolved a lot and is constantly evolving. So we're now looking at plastics, you know, with a material perspective as well as a product one, and that will be really important for informing how the negotiations unfold going forward. Other takeaways from the week. So some of you will be aware that there's a high ambition coalition of governments who have committed to a vision statement and some principles sort of pushing for the highest level of ambition within the treaty. And the high ambition coalition had a number of new members joining during the week from Mexico to the Cook Islands. So a huge kind of geographical diversity. And it's now standing at around 59 members TBC, but I think that's correct. So lots of countries now aligning themselves with that high ambition cohort, and it'll be very interesting as we move forward to see who else joins and how that takes shape. Throughout the negotiations at INC1, it also became clear that there are some sort of constellations of stakeholder groups who are becoming increasingly engaged in this space. So there's a civil society coalition which had over 100 members on the ground, and that included people from fence line communities living where petrochemical facilities are being built. It included indigenous peoples and a number of NGOs from all over the world. We also had the kind of soft launch, if you like, of the Science Scientists Network for an Effective Plastics Treaty, aka SNEPT, which is a group of scientists that's organizing around this and looking and engaging with member states and with UNEP to see how robust, impartial science can inform this process, and looking at how we can mitigate things like conflict of interest when it comes to the science that's used to inform the negotiations. And I think we'll be hearing more from SNEPT on one of the panels later. And we also had a lot of activity from the Business Coalition, who were appearing on panels and participating in a lot of the stakeholder consultations that were happening throughout the week. So it's clear that there's huge stakeholder interest, and these groups of stakeholders are becoming a lot more visible in the negotiations. And that's really exciting to see. And there's obviously appetite from member states to hear from these different stakeholder groups. When it comes to the negotiations themselves, I think some people who were following the process wondered, did we really get anything done during this week? Let me tell you, we did. There was quite a lot of substantive conversation actually on the scope of the agreement, what the potential objectives could be, and the structure of the agreement. And when I say the structure, I mean like what type of treaty is it? So, there are some proposals on the table, whether we have a kind of framework convention, which is, for example, a bit like the Paris Agreement, or whether we have something that's a specific convention. So it would be sort of all of the provisions included within the kind of context of that treaty. And so there were different perspectives from governments about which would be preferred. And it seemed to be steering towards a kind of specific convention. So that would be something like the Minamata Convention, which deals with mercury, if you want to take a look at that. I think we already heard that we had pretty broad participation from around 2,000 delegates from 160 countries. And I think that number is just going to grow more and more. There was huge interest. And I think something that took some of us by surprise was that this first negotiations was really a bit of a media moment as well. There was coverage from Reuters, AP News. There was actually a lot of interest in this, what was kind of technically quite a procedural meeting. So I think as well, the kind of public interest in this is really clear. We also had big participation from the informal sector, and we'll also be hearing from John, who's representing waste pickers later. But this is a really powerful and important voice in this space. And I think, as the waste pickers and the informal sector is organizing, it's really great to see that presence on the ground. And that's kind of captured, I think, in the launch of the Just Transition Initiative, which was led by, I think it was Kenya and South Africa. And that's really looking at, as the treaty, takes shape and comes into force, first, how can we listen to these impacted groups who have a very clear interest in ensuring that their workers' rights are protected, their health is protected as the agreement takes shape, but also, what does a just transition look like in the context of a plastics treaty? What does alternative employment or training look like? And how can we ensure that those people affected are included in the shaping of that process? Next slide. So I think that was kind of a lot of the really positive takeaways. And one thing that might be of interest, this is a little photograph here from an informal event that was hosted in the margins by SNEPT, which was called Ask a Scientist. And this was really cool. It was just an informal space where member states and stakeholders could come and ask some of the many scientists on the ground their burning questions about plastics. And it was clear, I think, in some of the kind of coffee and corridor conversations, there's still a lot of questions that people have. It doesn't mean that we don't have enough information to act, but we still need a lot more information. And so I think opportunities like this for member states to just sit down and have a chat with a scientist, and it ranging from social scientists to marine plastic pollution scientists, and just ask their questions was really cool. So I thought I would put a photo of that in here. So some of the more challenging stuff as part of this recap that I would probably note as quite important. So there was a multi-stakeholder forum the day before the negotiations formally launched. And, for various reasons, there were some concerns raised about this format of stakeholder engagement, both from the kind of stakeholders themselves, but also quite a few member states also flagged this as a potential concern. It's going to be really important to consider how do stakeholders inform this process in a way that's useful and it's equitable and it can kind of practically inform the negotiations. And I think the sort of multi-stakeholder forum format didn't really work for people. So there was quite a lot of discussion about that, and it was sort of not really resolved by the time the meeting concluded. So what sort of multi-stakeholder engagement looks like going forward is still a bit of a question mark. So we did have some conversation around substantive aspects of the treaty, like the potential structures, scope, but we didn't do a deep dive into the potential elements of the treaty. So what are the actual practical kind of policy interventions that we're going to have? There was no real concrete discussion on that. And I mean, part of that was because we spent a number of days discussing multi-stakeholder forum in plenary. So, going forward, it's going to be important to consider how can we sort of deep dive into some of these elements and use that time together more effectively. I think one of the other kind of key takeaways was sort of a divergence in the approaches for dealing with plastic pollution in the context of this treaty. So there were some countries that were favoring more of a kind of bottom-up approach and some favoring a sort of top-down approach. And I guess to keep this like as sort of straightforward as possible, in one way, you could think about kind of globally agreed measures and targets. So sort of legally binding requirements that are set at the global level, or you could look at it from sort of a national action plan approach. So some member states may want to sort of lead with a national perspective and kind of determine what they want to do at a national level, a bit like in the Paris Agreement, where you have nationally determined contributions. So everything is kind of set at that level. Whereas if you look at it top down, there would be a lot more requirements at the global level, which then kind of filter down to the national level. That's sort of a bit of I guess, a Treaty 101. And I tried to keep that simple, but if anyone needs elaboration in the chat, I can kind of come back to that later. The other kind of hot topic was around rules of procedure, which is a lot more exciting than it sounds. But, in order to have an effective negotiation, you need to have some kind of, you need to have some common parameters for how it's going to work. So in negotiations, you basically have these principles and you can refer back to the rules of procedure should anything go wrong during the negotiations. So they're kind of like your sort of Bible for the negotiations. And when we had the prep meeting in Senegal in May, there were still some outstanding issues with the rules of procedure that weren't resolved. And these mainly relate to the issue of voting. So some countries would prefer that we don't have voting within the context of the treaty, so that everything would be consensus based, whereas others would prefer that if necessary, we could default to having a vote on an issue. And there are various arguments. I'm wearing a neutral hat here, but so there are various arguments about which one would be better. But basically, this wasn't really resolved. And there's a rule, Rule 37, which relates to how the European Union vote. And by the end of the week, this was still kind of bracketed, which means that it wasn't really resolved as an issue during the negotiations. So that's one that will need to be dealt with kind of intercessionally and formalized at the next meeting, hopefully. The other thing that wasn't resolved is the Bureau. So we have a couple of Bureau members on this call. And the Bureau are the countries that are sort of guiding the content of the negotiations. So keeping things on schedule, banging the gavel when a decision is made, that kind of thing. And it's a very important role for, keeping negotiations on track. And we have representation on the Bureau from countries representing the different geographies around the world. So on the Bureau at the moment, we have confirmed Senegal, Rwanda, Antigua and Barbuda representing the small island developing states, Japan, Jordan, Sweden, the United States, Peru, the chair, and Ecuador, who will be the second chair. But there are two Bureau spots which have not been confirmed. So these are from the Eastern European group. So there were 4 candidates, I believe, but because of the nature of the Eastern European group and political sensitivities within that group, they weren't able to reach agreement on the Bureau representatives. So we actually still don't have a fully formed Bureau for the negotiations. Again, hopefully that's something that will be resolved by INC2. And then finally, on the challenges, there was only one delegate funded per developing country, which was actually a bit of an issue for having productive negotiations, because if you only have one person, you can't be in 2 places at once. So ideally, delegations would have at least 2 people so that you could have then, somebody, for example, following plenary and somebody following an informal working group. So that was something that was raised by a number of delegations and will be hopefully dealt with going forward as well. Okay, next slide. So this is just super quick, because I think I've already given probably too much information or spoken too long, but just on the timeline. So one of the other issues that had to be dealt with at this meeting was to kind of lock down in a little bit more detail the timeline for what the negotiations will look like. So as you heard earlier, Paris, the dates are confirmed. The third INC in Kenya confirmed And then we have locations, Canada and the Republic of Korea for the last two. We've also had 4 offers to host the diplomatic conference, the Conference of Plenipotentiaries. So Ecuador, Peru, Rwanda, and Senegal have all offered to host this. So that's something that will also need to be decided going forward, who gets to have the big kind of reveal of the agreement. And I'm sure that will be a lot of fun discussion for everyone involved. Next slide, please. So yeah, next steps. I don't really need to go into this because I think you've heard from Brenda, but we have this mandate for UNEP to produce the elements paper. And so the deadlines are coming up pretty fast. Just one thing to note is that we're probably not going to see any text for the treaty before INC3. You know, the elements, deciding what we actually want to do and how we're going to do it comes first, then drafting text and kind of working on that text comes next. So don't expect any text anytime soon, but the elements will be the kind of foundation for that, and happy to kind of spend time later or in the chat talking a bit more about kind of elements and means of implementation and what they mean. But I think the key thing to note is just that these conversations happen in parallel, because you can't really talk about what you're going to do without talking about how you're going to finance it, right? You can have the best treaty in the world, but if you don't have means of implementation, it's just kind of words on paper. So that's why these are kind of the 2 tracks. That's why the work was recommended to be divided in that way. And then last slide is just to kind of recap on those deadlines. So don't expect Christmas holidays if you're a stakeholder, because you'll be working on your elements submission for the 6th of January. Yeah, and I hope that those stakeholder inputs that you're all working on will be really useful for informing the country positions. So yeah, that is my rapid download of INC1.
Thank you so much, Chris. We really, really appreciate that. Was indeed rapid. And we're really excited to, it's very important to get as much information out as possible to folks that were not a part of INC1. That is the core driver that we're working towards today. And I'm really excited to introduce our first panel, the UN member states, and our moderator, our friend Alejandra Gonzalez, who's a regional coordinator from plastics policy at the WWF.
Thank you, Dave, and good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone who's connected now. And thank you to our panelists for joining us today for this 25 minutes conversation, where we would like to share with the audience your views on the main outcomes of this first session of negotiation and the challenges going forward in this process. So to start us off, please join me in welcoming our panelists. So we have Luis Valles. He is the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Human Mobility of Ecuador. Julius Piercy, he is the head of the Marine Military Policy at the Marine and Fisheries Directorate of the United Kingdom. Also, we have Oliver Washi, who is the Special Advisor to the Minister at the Ministry of Environment, Science and Technology and Innovation. And I think Juliet Cabrera couldn't join us today. So there's gonna be Julius, Luis, and Oliver in the panel. So welcome for the 3 of you. So the first round, the question is to everyone in the group, and we would like to know what is the feelings that you left Uruguay with after the first plastic treaty negotiation concluded? What did you believe are the main outcomes and achievements of the meeting? And I would like to start with Luis. Also, I want to congratulate you, Luis, for your appointment as Bureau Chair, beginning with INC3. So the floor is yours, and Luis, to start with that.
Thank you very much, Maria. Going into INC1, my expectations were that we were going to lay the foundation, for us to be able to engage in meaningful negotiations starting from INC2. And so I think for the most part, my expectations were met, that we did the setup. We looked at briefly the objectives. We looked at stakeholder engagement. We looked at you know, the elements that should go in, and I think we gave opportunity for all members to make their initial statements, and all of that went very well. So, you know, as far as what I expected, I think INC1 was a very, very successful setup meeting, and it gives us the platform for us to prepare adequately for the next sessions, particularly INC2.
Thank you, Oliver. Luis, I know that I see that you raised your hand. So do you also share the same feeling with Oliver regarding the successful outcomes of the material?
Absolutely. So I suppose one of the first things that I felt was a sense of relief. And that's not really because the negotiations have ended. I think that they were quite thrilling. But I think it was relief that we, you know, although we didn't get all the procedural issues out of the way, as Chris Dixon said a bit earlier, we were able to get into some more substantive discussions in the second part of the meeting. So and I was pretty excited about the new process that we were able to secure that give stakeholders a meaningful input between INCs 1 and 2 happening next May. Because we spoke to many of you at the start about what you wanted to see in order, what processes you wanted to have in place to make sure that the way you were engaging with the treaty actually meant that the process was there to make sure that countries could listen, could digest the information you provided, and then reflect that in their own submissions. Obviously, this is a country-led process, so ultimately countries will need to decide, but by having this process where stakeholders are able to input first, really I think makes a big difference. And also as a member of the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution, I was really pleased that we managed to secure nearly all the priorities set out in our joint ministerial statement for the High Ambition Coalition, minus a few little procedural issues.
Well, thanks, Julius. Let's see if Luis, you have the floor. If you can. Great.
No, first of all, well, thank you very much, and thank you to Ocean Plastics Leadership Network for this invitation. I think we'll start with dialogue and start talking about what happened during the intersessional. We had the opportunity to hear from the different delegations from different regional groups what we want about this legally binding international instrument on plastic pollution. And also it was very good. And I have to say that I feel proud that it was really good to talk as Ecuadorian delegation with many stakeholders, with civil society, with the scientific community, with private sector, with other international organizations that were represented there in Punte del Este. And to see the commitment, as I said, to go to this legally binding instrument with the approach of the whole life cycle of politics. The first achievement is this, you know, that we have started this negotiation process.
And as stated by the UK government during the INC, the international level measures will be needed to comprehensively address the transboundary issue of plastic pollution. And we know that it's quite early in the process because states will have to submit until February 10. But in your opinion, what could this international level measures could look like in the treaty?
Wow, so that's the million-dollar question. So I think as you kind of pointed out, I think we'll have a much better idea by the next INC once countries have had a chance to send in all their submissions on what measures they think should be included. But as Ambassador Meza Quadra said earlier on, this is not going to be an easy task. What I think we do know is that given the state of the evidence, that plastic pollution is set to increase exponentially over the coming decades, we do need measures that address the whole life cycle of plastic, from production and consumption all the way to waste management. In terms of what will actually be included, I think it's fairly safe to say that there'll be an obligation for countries to produce national action plans. I hope that's not too controversial. And accompanying that, there'll be there should be some mechanism for reporting and assessing progress against the objectives of the treaty. But when it comes to other international level measures, I expect there's going to be a discussion on things such as harmonization of standards, how to regulate problematic or unnecessary plastic products, as well as matters such as sustainable levels of plastic production and consumption, and how to ensure that there's going to be a just transition for the informal sector. But I think the key here is that countries don't have all the answers, and there are different situations in many different countries. So it's really important that we hear from stakeholders about what measures they want to see in the treaty. So I think it's also important that we don't just view the treaty sort of as a mechanism to impose regulations as well, but we also look at it as an opportunity to provide long-term certainty to investors as well, and a kind of a catalyst for innovation as well. So really, as we sort of approach this over the sort of the Christmas holidays, as Chris kindly pointed out, I do urge all of you to think about the kinds of things that the treaty could do for you, and then speak to countries, point them towards the submissions that you've drafted, and try and ensure that some of those views have had a chance to be digested by countries before they put in their submissions later in February. And yes, I hope that all of this will sort of really set us up to have a really good, rich set of options, which we'll be able to discuss in a lot more depth at the next time CMA.
So as the previous presentation mentioned, that there will be 2 working groups now onwards, and one issue that will be discussed is the implementation and the means of implementation that will be needed. So Oliver, I wanted to ask you, like, the African group was very active in the negotiation and championed for the inclusion of this necessary enabling conditions in the global treaty. So in your perspective and the discussions that took place during the INC first, what are these relevant enabling conditions that the treaty could provide to assist states in complying with these future obligations?
Thank you very much once again, Maria. The African group highlighted the disadvantaged position that our region is in when it comes to means of implementation. So there are 3 or 4 basic things that the African group were very emphatic about. And that is to ensure that the instrument provides adequate means of implementation that will ensure that all member states are able to meet their obligations under the instrument. This includes adequate and sustainable funding that is readily accessible, including the establishment of a dedicated multilateral fund, the provision of effective channels for the transfer and deployment of technology, and scientific research, as well as the implementation of capacity building programs, all in line with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and national capabilities. That's the first set of requirements. The other is to ensure that the instrument provides international standards for product design and one that eliminates harmful chemicals in plastics production, while promoting the hierarchical principles of reusing, recycling, and recovery. Now, this is the position of the African group, but you might recall that I was also sitting as the representative of Ghana. And from that end, the key things that Ghana wants to see in this instrument is a provision that addresses the problem of legacy plastics, because we believe that plastics has caused a lot of problems that exist today, and we haven't been able to find any solution to it. And we don't want a situation where we come up with a treaty that only addresses future problems. And so we actually call for the establishment of what we call a legacy fund to ensure that mostly industry contributes generously into the fund. You know, even that coming into effect before the treaty is enacted and becomes operational. And that during the operational phase of the treaty, maybe some of the funds that are provided in the multilateral fund will also be channeled towards the addressing this legacy problem that most developing countries, especially countries in Africa, you know, have as a problem. So those are the key things that the African group and countries in Africa, including Ghana, are hoping that this instrument will provide.
Where do you see are the main challenges or obstacles going forward in the negotiation process? And this intersessional period is going to be key for advancing in developing documents, as Ambassador Gustavo mentioning, like all that UNEP will be preparing for the discussions. That where do you see are the main challenges, and also what do you think will be will need to be accomplished between this intersessional period before INC2?
The main challenges between now and INC2, I think, are going to be, first of all, the extremely tight timelines. We have hardly any time at all in treaty negotiation terms to make sure we, first of all, get the information that we need. We're then able to digest it and we're able to translate it into country positions. So we have a real issue there, I think, around how tight these negotiations are going to be. We have obviously heard there are differing views as well between countries' positions on, we're hearing top-down and bottom-up approaches for the treaty. This is probably going to carry on throughout the negotiation process, so something we will obviously need to be aware of and keep tracking as the negotiations progress. And then finally, I think one of the challenges is that we may not have anticipated quite to this extent is how some of those small procedural issues can sometimes throw things off course if we're not too careful and that we don't resolve them sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Julius. And I think Luis is now back with us. So hope you can hear me well. Luis, so I'll give you the floor for the next question. And Latin America and the Caribbean countries have agreed on the importance of going beyond voluntary national actions and country-driven measures. So what do you think this is critical, like to maintain this approach at the international level during the negotiation process?
Yes, thank you, Alejandra. And I'm really sorry about the inconvenience before. Can you hear me now? Great, thank you very much. No, I don't know if you heard me before, but I was telling that I feel that we left Punta del Este with a positive feeling, and that we have achieved, I think, good outcomes We had the possibility to hear all the stakeholders, all the delegations that they wanted to speak, they wanted to say what they want of this treaty, and that was very positive. Also, that we were able to also to sort some challenges that we had, and I think we start talking on substance and the challenges that we face. We didn't solve them, but we were able to work with them. And so I think that was positive. And also I mentioned that it was a very constructive and positive participation of GRULAC as a regional group. And coming back to your question, I do think that there is not such a thing of a perfect model. But of course, we have to ensure consistency in our mandate from Resolution 514 from Nairobi to respond effectively to the negative impacts, challenges, and threats to human health and environment. So we need, of course, we need to debate, we need to get consensus, and we are going to work as Resolution 514, the mandate is towards an international legally binding instrument that includes both binding and voluntary approaches. But we have to recognize also that complementary actions and coherence and coordinate long-term global vision is needed. So it's very important also the cooperation, coordination, and complementarity among relevant regions and international conventions and instruments. We are quite aware of the negative impacts of plastic pollution to the environment and health. And thus we have the scientific evidence, and we have to take into consideration the moment we negotiate. And we need, for that, we need a global commitments. We need global commitments because it's not enough. And we have to be conscious on that, that it's not enough a voluntary national approach and also country-driven measures. It is, we will need, of course, national implementation plans, but for that, we need also the global commitments for those national implementation plans. And I have to say it, and we have faced in other MEAs problems when we go with this voluntary approach, or only with a voluntary approach and not global commitments. And we see what's happening, for instance, with the Paris Agreement and when we are negotiating also in climate change. We are doing great efforts in our negotiations on climate change, but we see the results are not as we would like them to be. That's why we need to have in focus, and we need to think that we want a legally binding global instrument. And here, you know, again, it's so important to hear all the stakeholders involved in this. We are, as I mentioned before, we are very proud as Ecuadorian delegation that we had the opportunity to track, that we've been tracking from before, from years ago actually, but to track also in Punte del Este with different stakeholders, with the scientific community, with civil society, with private sector, and to hear, because it's very important to hear from them how we need to go ahead. We need a transparent, inclusive negotiation, and that's very important. And again, you know, we need global commitments, global agreements for also global problems. It's not enough national agreements or national commitments. It's not enough regional agreements. We need global commitments. Thank you very much, Alejandra.
Thank you, Luis, for your intervention. And with this, I would like to close this panel, thanking all our panelists for joining. And what I see from this first panel is that there is a positive feeling after INC, a lot of engagement from different stakeholders, but also the commitment from governments to work hard during this INC intersessional period. And we definitely wish you all the luck to get to the substantive discussions during this intersessional time, but also looking forward to INC2. So thank you very much to the three of you. I'll pass it over to Martha.
Thank you so much, Maria. I'm going to get us back a little bit into the national action or the national engagement that we've been working on through the Global Treaty Dialogues program that have expanded to the national treaty dialogues. Like Dave mentioned earlier in the beginning of our session, we're currently active in 7 countries, including Chile, Pakistan, Malaysia, Ghana, United States, Indonesia, and the United Kingdom. And I'm gonna walk you through the recap of the 2022 and some of the insights from our national dialogues that have emerged. First of all, I want to thank all of our partners that help us bring those national treaty dialogues to life, including Plastic Oceans, GPAB, WWF, Meridian Institute. Thank you all for joining us on this journey this year and helping us through and with development of these national treaty dialogues. I'm going to share some of the methodology in terms of the thinking of why we're organizing those dialogues and what we're hoping to achieve through them. So from our perspective as OPLN, we see our mission in building this national and regional capacity for an inclusive and effective engagement in the UN Plastics Treaty process, and as well as development of national action plans and cross-sector collaboration for the plastic crisis intervention. Our work, the way we see it in terms of structuring, is connecting the stakeholders, building capacity, and then identifying alignment. So finding those common grounds is where we believe there's a huge opportunity in acceleration of the process forward and together. So I'm going to walk you through some of the insights from our treaty dialogue, specifically focusing on 2 countries today, Pakistan being one, and we're also going to talk about United Kingdom a little bit later. So our Pakistan treaty dialogues took place between January and June 2022. So ahead of INC1, the Pakistan multi-stakeholder group was able to get together 2 times and analyze, discuss, and collaborate on potential provisions and ideas that they specifically want to work on through the UN Plastics Treaty process. So we organized a layer of sentiment surveys that were deployed live at the convening to help the Pakistan stakeholder groups identify their positioning in regards to specific provisions and identify priorities by urgency. Today, I'm going to share a bunch of insights from those reports, just to quickly let you digest on where we've seen some level of alignment across the Pakistan stakeholder groups. So number 1 was waste management alignment. So specifically focusing on prioritizing building and improving control of waste disposal facilities, such as engineered landfills, to safely manage and prevent leakage of plastic waste. 73% of stakeholders in participation have agreed that this is a top priority for Pakistan right now. Second point was on recycling approach alignment. So specifically focusing on funding upgrades and updates to the current recycling and reuse system, and with a specific priority on convenience to the consumer. 67% of stakeholders have agreed that this is a top priority. When we organize the sentiment surveys, we also focus on where they commonly or together disagree. What we did see in Pakistan specifically is, for instance, a value chain distrust. So 74% as well of Pakistan stakeholders deeply distrust the engagement of plastic producers in Pakistan and how they will engage and lead in eliminating plastic pollution. They also specifically expressed their concern with the lack of clarity on how the Global Plastics Treaty will include waste pickers and make sure they're adequately represented and included in this process. So that is a top priority issue in Pakistan that we were able to identify for sessions. They also see that 80% believe that academia will actually benefit the most from some of the efforts here across the research and development groups in Pakistan, specifically in regards to global financing for implementation of the Plastics Treaty. Those are a few of the insights from our Pakistan report. You can go ahead and read, and we'll share a link in the chat for all of you take a look. It's a prototype of our feedback loop that we're hoping to establish between countries, cross-sector engagement, and the treaty process to help on the granular view, bring forward ideas that add value to specific regions and locations. In November, so just 3 weeks before the INC1, OPLN has hosted UK trade dialogues where we specifically focus on identifying key areas across upstream, midstream, and downstream in regards to the official documentation and provisions released by UNEP ahead of INC1. We brought together stakeholders across NGO, petrochemical brands, CPG, academia, waste management, packaging converters, breakthrough from plastic, and others together to discuss, collaborate on where they believe the top priorities are for the UK. So what you're looking at right now is a granular view into sector-specific priorities with most agreement and disagreement across upstream considerations. These are still in the process of analysis, but we just wanted to share some ideas that are being discussed through those dialogues to give you a sense of where we are moving forward with such process. And to just share a few across upstream, midstream, and downstream, we're looking at prioritizing recyclable, biodegradable plastics. We're looking at considering provision to set limits on production and other polymers to sustainable levels. There are also priorities set for universal design, for recycling guidelines, and in downstream, deposit returns that are broad, simple, and line. These are one of many ideas that have been discussed during the dialogues, but those are ideas that have received support across multi-stakeholder groups. And we're looking forward to continuing this process moving forward with the UK government with our following session, which is currently planned for the month of March. More on that, please stay tuned. We'll keep you posted. And from now, I'm going to hand it over back to Dave to get into our Q&A session, specifically focused on the informal waste sector needs and perspectives from INC1, featuring John. Hand it over here to Dave.
Thank you so much for being here with us today. And John Chawea is the president of the Kenyan Waste Picker Association. He's a waste picker based in Kisumu, Kenya. He started waste picking at the age of 13 years old. And through his work as a waste picker, he noticed all the inequalities and injustices that affect waste pickers in his community, despite the integral and vital role that they play in providing livelihoods and improving the environmental conditions in their cities. And at the age of 18, John started organizing waste pickers to defend and protect their interest. In 2021, he got elected as the president of the National Association of Waste Pickers in Kenya, and he's currently enrolled in Maseno University doing his BA in Communications and Media under a scholarship program, and he's also a member of the International Alliance of Waste Pickers, and had the opportunity to meet John firsthand down in Uruguay. And John, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here today.
It's just vital that all stakeholders understand specifically what's urgent, what's needed for the waste picker communities around the world. Could you say that you can maybe talk about some of the most urgent outcomes that you feel that the international waste picker community needs to have happen as a result of this, these discussions and this move to a global treaty?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the very urgent one, I would say, and it has also been mentioned a few times, is the need for a just transition planning that brings waste pickers to the table. I think this is one of the most important things that we've been very much lobbying for. This is owing to the resolution that was made earlier in Nairobi, in the UNEA 5.2 to end plastic pollution. And we also know that for sure the plastic menace is a global problem. And we also know that West speakers have been like in the forefront of this war. I would say like that. And our call for just transition now is because we know how the inequalities, and we also know how West speakers in very many different ways are not privileged in a way to be always incorporated in these policy-making processes. So we are also saying that West speakers have that historic knowledge of handling plastic, because, for example, myself, I started handling plastic when I was 13, and when I first started handling this in the dump, there were my colleagues there that had handled it for over 20 years. And right now, there's that knowledge that we build over time. And I would say that that knowledge shouldn't be like assumed. That knowledge should be put into practice. And this policy-making process should really consider tapping into that knowledge that West speakers also have.
Thank you so much, John. So in your hopes, what do you think the informal waste sector could look like 20 years from now if this treaty is effective?
I think that is a bit of a tough question to also answer, but I think overall, like West speakers need like some universal social protection to make work overall more decent and less informal. But we can't solve things by forcing formalization. Formalization measures, those like mandatory registration, which we.
Hey, John, we're losing you a little bit. Maybe we could go camera off. It's kind of freezing.
So those things that.
Hey, John, it kind of froze. It kind of froze up a little bit. Maybe if it happens again, maybe we'll go camera off. But we just lost your last 20 seconds. Can you say that again?
Oh, I was saying that. Hello?
Yep, you're good. You're good now. You're clear now.
So I was saying that we need universal social protections to make like our work overall more decent and less informal. But we can't solve things by forcing formalization measures like mandatory registration, which we've been facing lately from different countries without any benefits. So informality can, I say, be an entry point for workers coming from more marginalized backgrounds like West speakers. We hardly like access most of the like social amenities that we should. We also know that the environment that we work in is a very risky one, and these are some of the things that we are foreseeing that in the next maybe 20 years. So it's not like it's not necessarily like ethical to say we must do away with informal work. Rather, we must ensure that there are ongoing opportunities for advancement in the value chain and into more formal and decent work. So I think I foresee that with a lot of capacity building, there are some of the things that we can greatly change for the informal waste workers in working in our sector.
Thank you so much. It's interesting to zoom out and think about think about all this sort of a very big picture, and your sense of how it could be unethical to force the informal sector to formalize, I think is important. It's really important for all of us to take that in as like a sort of core core communication today. Last question, and then we're going to bring you into our multi-stakeholder panel, so we'll be able to talk to you more. But last question: what are the most effective short-term actions that industry and NGO and a lot of the folks that are listening to you speak right now can do today to support the informal waste sector?
So just like I mentioned that we come from a very marginalized community, and there's
You're good.
Okay. So there's quite a lot that municipalities or NGOs can do to help our sector, and I would say that one of the things could be capacity building, because we already have like a very good knowledge of the sector we work in. It's only that because we are underprivileged in very many ways, we hardly like access other opportunities, and industries can fund like municipalities to undertake full waste collection, and pressure governments because like NGOs and other industries have that capacity to negotiate better with the government. So it can be something very vital for us if it is something that can also come from these stakeholders to pressure the government to also work with specifically waste pickers who already have that historic knowledge of providing these services and of reducing the amount of plastic waste that exists in these communities. So if this is something that can be re-engineered in a way that it is a bottom-up approach, because most of the waste pickers are the people that are actually doing this work. So when it comes to a way where a plan should be done to curb this problem, then the biggest number of people working in this chain are waste pickers, and they can like already very well do it. I think industries and NGOs can also like finance equipment, because it is a problem even where you come from that right now waste pickers are placed in a way that we are competing with very big industries that already have the financing and the equipment to do a lot of things that we could be doing with the management of this menace. And because we are not financially stable or better equipped with certain things, and also with the academics, we are I would say that we are not in a better place to also access some of the privileges that could be there to handle it.
Thank you, John. This is our final panel. Because of some of the technical difficulties, and I think it's just want to throw out, it's like so incredibly powerful that we can bring so many people and so many voices from all over the world in one setting. I mean, if you think about, 5 years ago, this never would have been possible. And I think we've heard from so many folks that this specific global agreement, this is a brand new way to be able to engage everyone from around the world. Not to say not without technical challenges, but we're just so excited to have everybody here. So at this point on, I'm going to invite up the rest of the panelists, and I'm so excited. And we'll spotlight you guys kind of as we find you in the chat here. But I want to bring up Yoni Sharan from Systemic. How are you, Yoni?
Hi, doing well. Thanks, Dave.
I want to bring up Tricia Farrelly from Massey University, who got up very early to be with us today. Thank you so much. I want to bring up Jody Roussel from Nestle, and Gail Collette from Plastics Europe, and Jacob Keem Hammerson from EIA to join John. So we're gonna find you guys and spotlight you as we go. But thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. And I think just to kind of throw this out to everyone. I mean, I think the question we want to start with specifically is like, what is the feeling that all of you left Uruguay with after this first plastics treaty negotiation, and what do you believe the main outcomes and achievements were? If you could just maybe give us a summary, sort of a high level overview in your POV. Jacob, maybe you could go first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dave. To keep it brief, I think it was really positive to hear some of the level of ambition coming from member states and regions, the African group, the group of Latin American countries, and the Pacific islands as well, coming up with really ambitious positions. And it was also really great to hear from so many different stakeholders and rights holders, their interventions in plenary, which really kind of gave those amazing real world examples of what we're trying to do to curb this plastics crisis. So I think that was super important. And for us to come out after, quite long discussions of meaningful ways for stakeholders and right holders to engage intersessionally and have those views presented to member states is really important. And I think that's perhaps not going through what was the multi-stakeholder forum, which we perhaps didn't think that provided a kind of equitable and timely way for those voices to be heard. I think it's really good that we're charting a way forward for those important reflections to be heard throughout the negotiations to come.
Thank you, Jacob. Jody, how about you? How'd you feel leaving Uruguay?
I would say tremendously optimistic. The momentum that built at the event was incredible, and there were so many people deeply concerned about solving this challenge together. That was my major takeaway. I mean, in terms of the themes and how that changed, one of them certainly was that voluntary commitments are tools of the past, and regulation is the pathway we need for the future, because we recognize that the recycling facilities that have been built under a national action approach and voluntary commitments are inadequate today, but no one can resolve this alone. Another thing that really came out would be the role of extended producer responsibility laws and financing of infrastructure, sharing of those financial responsibilities, and support of the least developed countries in particular, as well as a just transition for the waste picking community and all impacted communities.
Thank you, Jody. And Gail, how about yourself? How'd you feel after flying back to Europe?
Very energized. I don't know if it was because it was a very sunny and warm country when we went there, but very energized. A bit like Jody said, because of I think that everyone wants to have the same outcome at the end. The goal is really to end plastics in the environment. But one point that I think was I really picked up on is there's really a confirmation that all stakeholders need to be involved. Really, and I think John just before confirmed that. We need to have involvement from the scientists. We need to have the social workers or the waste pickers experience. So we need to have the indigenous communities and consumers involved in all of this, as well as industry, because there we can also share our knowledge of plastics and also share about what we're doing in terms of innovation. So I leave it to that.
Thank you so much, Gail. Really appreciate it. And Yoni, I'm going to ask you, what's your sort of high level take, and then I have a question for you as well.
Jody stole my word, but I'm going to say it as well, which is optimism. And to be honest, I came into Uruguay already optimistic, because if you asked me 1 year ago, I wouldn't believe that we're going to have a global plastic treaty negotiation, right? So even the fact that we have this, I think, is something that we shouldn't take for granted, and we should all celebrate. When we wrote Breaking the Plastic Wave, we didn't account for a global plastic treaty. So I think it's going to be tremendous impact. And then leaving out of Uruguay, also very optimistic, I think for two main reasons. One is, there's many reasons, but just to keep it short. So two reasons for now. One is the coalitions that are forming. So there's 3 coalitions that I'm so impressed by. The first is the High Ambition Coalition of member states. And these are 50 countries now that are showing up with a lot of ambition, against all odds, and asking for a very ambitious treaty and negotiating for a very ambitious treaty, which is fantastic to see. The second one is the Business Coalition for a Global Plastic Treaty. many of our representatives who are here on the call, and you saw these people in Uruguay going from meeting to meeting with governments, asking for an ambitious treaty, asking to really kind of showing up as an industry and asking to do their part and to have regulation. And we even heard Jody ask for that now. And then the third one, and not least, is the scientist, right? Kind of the scientist network for the plastic treaty, SNAPT, also incredibly powerful and important. So all these coalitions representing different stakeholders fills me with optimism. And then the second point, just very quickly, I heard so many people in Uruguay talk about reuse and reuse mandates and reuse, the importance of reuse systems and how we need to have standards for reuse. That is so important. I think that our research and many other people's research shows that without reuse, we cannot really solve plastic pollution in a way that is equitable and economic and reduces greenhouse gases and so many other things. And the fact that so many people are talking about taking reuse to standard, I think is wonderful. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Dave.
Amazing. And Tricia, like how'd you feel when you left Uruguay?
Oh, well, if I'm speaking from my own POV, my own point of view, as one of the people who are trying to get this SNAPT group up and running, extremely energized too and excited about the amount of support that we've received through interventions from member states for independent science body. Lots of talk around the tables for the need for such a group is very exciting for us. And related to that, more broadly speaking, I suppose, to how important it is to hear from so many different stakeholders. Would love to have heard from more representatives from Indigenous major group, from the previous UNEA. Would like to sort of hear more from them. Fantastic to hear from waste pickers as an example of the informal economy. I'd love to hear more informal sectors that we need to hear voices, for example, around formal and informal economies for fisheries, for example, and agriculture. Really need to have those people at the table, more voices there. But very excited to hear a complete reframing, really, and we've been seeing this as an evolution of the way that we've been defining and referring to plastics now as a complex mix of chemicals plus carbon, and real attention to right at the top of the pipe in terms of recognition that 99% of plastics are made of fossil fuels. So really, really pushing up at the supply chain there, and also a real recognition of the toxicity of plastics and how that also affects things right downstream, including just transitions for waste pickers, but also talking too about remediation measures and legacy plastics. So really the full lifespan of plastics has been exciting for me to hear in the first INC.
Thanks, Tricia. Yoni, back to you, quick question. So Systemic put out a global instrument insight guide that referenced the advocacy positions, I think of 8 sort of major advocacy groups, many of which are on this panel today. What would you say, we focus, organizationally as alignment, but on alignment, but just curious what you saw that first were like some of the major differences between some of these eight stakeholder groups.
Thanks, Dave. And so we looked at 8 groups, which by the way are very different. So including some kind of industry groups and plastic producers, but also civil society. So 8 very different stakeholder groups. And everybody asked me about the differences between them. But I would like to start, if I may. I'll keep this very short. But first acknowledge that there's a lot of areas of agreement, and I don't take that for granted. When I looked at the result, when we filled in this activity, or when we did this activity, seeing the amount of agreement between stakeholders, even in very different parts of the spectrum, is something we did not expect to see. There's agreement about the need for definitions, agreement on reuse, as I mentioned before, agreement on the need to support the informal sector, infrastructure, collection, technical assistance, financial assistance. So there's a long list of things that people actually do agree on. Of course, the devil's in the detail, but there's a lot of areas of agreement. Still, to answer your question, I think there's 2 main areas of kind of different views between stakeholders, let's call it that. The first is the top-down versus the bottom-up. And Christina from EA talked about this quite a bit when she was kind of sharing her remarks, but very different views of some stakeholders seeing this as a global kind of a top-down treaty with real teeth, with real penalties for non-compliance, and really seeing that as the main mechanism. while others see it more as a bottom-up kind of voluntary agreement. So a lot of difference of opinion there in terms of the level of ambition, if you want to call that. And then the second area of disagreement between stakeholder groups is, some groups asking for caps of plastic production or even bans on problematic plastics, virgin production reduction, substitution. These are areas that are obviously different groups have very different views. Some representatives from industry, especially the upstream players, plastic producers, mostly opposing those kind of clauses or provisions, while other organizations, mainly from civil society, asking for those things. So those are, I think, some of the things that the committee will have to work through in terms of the main disagreements, but also pointing out that there is a lot of areas of agreement, and I think that is important. If somebody wants to take a look at the comparison, I'll put the link in one more time in the chat, or you can just Google systemic plastic treaty. We'll keep it updated over time. So as more positions come in, we'll keep it updated, and hopefully it will be useful for people to understand what are different groups asking for. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Yoni. I think I just want to maybe follow up. I think thanks for laying out the agreement. I want to stick with the agreement piece, right? And maybe this is a good time to bring you in, Angel. So, there's certainly quite a lot at stake with the petrochemical sector via these negotiations, and many stakeholders and countries are like actively discussing capping plastic production, as Yanni mentioned. I mean, we're not going to get into that. It's not a part of the process quite yet, but again, we think it's all the most important thing at this sense is this state of everything is to surface alignment. So Yoni mentioned some of the key differences. I'm curious, where do you see alignment across stakeholder groups specifically? I mean, are there points of interest where there's already alignment between Plastic Europe and the High Ambition Country Coalition, for example?
Well, thank you, Dave. I think let me first come back to the capping plastic production, because I think everyone is talking about that or has talked about it. So maybe just to explain, our industry is currently undergoing a huge reshaping to transition to the circular economy. And for us, the circular economy is the main solution to target plastics pollution, and also to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So what we expect the treaty to do is that it sets the enabling conditions to accelerate the transition to the circular economy. And that's why we are so supportive of a global treaty on plastic. So what we really want is to have a market pool for circular feedstock. So what we need is to gain access to these feedstock, to these plastic waste, which currently ends up in the environment or which are not recycled. So that will ultimately reduce reliance on fossil fuel, on fossil feedstock. So I mean, that's we're turning it around, like not looking at cap, but looking at having the enabling conditions in place to allow the circular economy to accelerate. So let me give a few examples on where we have common grounds with the High Ambition Coalition and with other stakeholders. So maybe I start with what the key deliverables for success. So in terms of elimination of problematic plastics, I mean, who does not want to eliminate problematic materials? I mean, everyone would like to, no one wants to use materials which are not useful. But maybe I think there's a question on how you define unnecessary plastic, avoidable plastic. So I think maybe there we need to be working a bit more on that, on the definitions on what is actually unnecessary plastic. So I park this one and I move on to the next one, which is about the global sustainability criteria and the standards for plastics. So I mean, there we will find some common ground. We are in favor of harmonization. We are also in favor of having definitions in the treaty and also having technical standards in the treaty. So really to harmonize it. So that's where we see the treaty as being very, very, very good. In terms of global baseline and targets for sustainability throughout the life cycle of plastic, I made an intervention during the INC on behalf of the chemical and plastics industry. It was on reporting on a baseline, on having that doesn't need to have harmonized common format and templates. including key indicators, and that will facilitate reporting and in an easy manner for everyone without creating excessive burden, mostly for developing countries and small businesses. So on that one, we would have common grounds. We will have to work on the details. And then moving on into terms of transparency. So we've heard a lot about transparency during the INC, in particular in relation to additives. So I mean, on this one, we acknowledge that some work is needed to be more transparent. And we're currently working on developing new technologies to provide the appropriate data at the appropriate time and information while ensuring CBI. So we support, for example, digital product passport, and our members are involved in a pilot a project on blockchain projects. So we're currently working with partners as well on developing a database of additives used in a plastics application. So again, like to provide more transparency. So I think we agree, but again, like we need to work on the details. There's an issue with confidential information, so we need to make sure that can work in practice. So I think that maybe in terms of financial assistance, there we are also very supportive of EPR. So for us, EPR is the right way forward. But again, how do we define it? How can a global EPR work? So I think we need to make sure that it can work in every location under every circumstances. So, okay, maybe it was quite long, but I think just to summarize, I mean, we have a lot of common grounds. I think we need to work on the details. Maybe we won't agree on some of the details, but I think we need to work on those ones. So looking at problematic plastics is one. Looking at how the treaty can benefit the whole societies on the enabling conditions would be necessary there. So yeah, a bit long. Sorry about that. Open for questions.
Thank you, Angel. We really appreciate that. Appreciate you going into depth. And look, I think again, where there is agreement and alignment, that's how we truly believe we can accelerate progress on all of this. So it's good to get that out on the table as soon as possible. So thank you so much. I want to talk a little bit. Actually, Tricia, if I could bring you back in. I mean, like, so on one of the other mandates from UNEA 5.2 is the global agreement will acknowledge plastics' potential risks to human health. I mean, how do you anticipate this entering the negotiations in practice? And, you know, how's it all going to come to life and come out in this process? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, we've already seen a significant amount of publications, both from UNEP and from the international scientific community, on the impacts of plastics, broadly speaking, on human health. I think while there is certainly a lot more research that needs to be done on microplastics' impact on human health, the indicators show that will have a significant impact on human health more broadly across the full lifespan of plastics, right from the production of polymers right through to where all plastics will eventually end up as micro and nano-sized plastics. That is simply the fact. So we're really surrounded by plastics and microplastics in all sort of stages of our life. We sort of look around our room now and we are literally breathing in microplastics. So there will be more and more discussion about that, but we certainly have plenty of evidence to show that the chemical impacts of plastics do have a significant impact and are having a significant impact on human health, and that the impacts are not just intergenerational, but they're also transgenerational, and they have impacts on human health, again, throughout the full lifespan, including production, consumption, management, and so on and so forth. So I think when we're talking about I just want to throw in here the idea of kind of techno fixes or technological solutions to the plastics crisis. We should be drawing heavily on independent evidence-based, solutions-based evidence in order to make sound decisions around how we respond to the plastics issues and it impacts not only on human health and environment. But I'd also just want to say here too that while this is an environmental law, we need to, and I'm really pleased to see this at the INC as well, we're starting to acknowledge more clearly that impacts on environment absolutely directly impact human health and that these are inextricable issues here. So in answer to your question, Dave, I think that the question of human health throughout the INC process should be supported by peer-reviewed, independent, evidence-based science and solutions-based evidence is really important here. We have no time to waste. It's not about we just need more data. We've got plenty of data to act. But what is the evidence-based solutions that we're seeking as we move really, really quickly through submissions from member states and through from civil society here. I mean, we've got a really, really tight time frame between now and January for multi-stakeholders and February for member states. So our science group is poised and ready to at least start the initial phases of supporting member states as they make these really important decisions right from this first submission. But we'll be more organised before INC2. Obviously, we've got to get ourselves sorted, but we're inviting member states to contact us, and I'll send through the link soon. If you're looking for independent science around a particular issue in order to make your submission, please contact us and we will put you in contact with the right person. We have a body now of over 500 independent scientists from all over the world, and that includes around policy, includes product stewardship, EPR. It's not just biophysical scientists, it's also social scientists. And again, it's the broadest understanding of science, including Indigenous rights holders, knowledge holders, citizen scientists, excellent citizen scientists, and so on, that will contribute to this space.
Thank you so much for that, Tricia. Really appreciate it. And if there's anything you'd like to share in the chat, I'm sure lots of folks on this call would be excited to deep dive even more. Jody, let's go to you. Really love to talk about the business coalition for a moment. That's being led by World Wildlife Fund and Ellen MacArthur Foundation. There was, as mentioned, there was a really big presence in Uruguay. Led by some of the biggest consumer packaged companies in the world, including Nestle and Unilever and Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Mars. And why is this plastics treaty so important for the biggest global brands? And if there's any message that this coalition wants to send consumers and governments alike, what would it be?
Thanks very much, Dave. As you may know, the business coalition was 85 businesses before the negotiations, and we now have a waiting list of 285 other businesses who have asked to join us. So the group of businesses supporting the treaty is growing very quickly. Now, why are we here? We recognize that we're not going to get a level playing field without harmonized regulation. So businesses who are concerned about the environment, about the stability of climate, about all of the issues that plastic pollution impacts, it's logical for them to join this coalition that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and WWF have helped businesses launch. We don't want to remain in limbo. And the current landscape of voluntary commitments and the past decade characterized by slow and fragmented policy development, high compliance costs because of the differences in policies between countries, even in some cases between provinces or states, limited economies of scale for recycled plastics, and the human rights risks that are associated with lack of standard compliance methodologies. We don't want to stay in this space. We want to move to a space with harmonized regulation that's actually going to enable business to support government as a partner in solving these problems. The discussion around top-down, bottom-up, you could rephrase top-down as actually pro-business or pro-SME inclusion. And the reason for that is that a top-down agreement where there are internationally accepted, legally binding guidelines creates lower compliance costs for business, and it also drives economies of scale in the types of solutions that we need to build to address plastic pollution in a systematic way. Now, in terms of where we are as a business coalition, I know we're a bit tight on time, so I'll just share with you 3 main highlights, and happy to delve into any of them in greater detail. One of them is around global rules. They're important for business. We can't rely on national action plans. Second, we know we can't recycle our way out of the plastic pollution crisis, and we need to move forward with waste management capabilities being built up, yes, but we also need to define a clear set of targets and obligations to support progress in the area of reducing plastic production and increasing the circular economy approach, so circulating all the plastic items that can't be eliminated, keeping them in the economy at their highest value, and preventing and remediating hard to abate both macro and microplastic leakage into the environment, and addressing legacy waste that already is there. And thirdly, that negotiations have to set priorities in terms of developing the effective control measures. We recognize that there's an entire world of challenges to be addressed by the negotiators who are coming together to develop this treaty. And we know that many sectors could be covered over time, but we want to target the most relevant plastic applications and tackle key steps of the value chain with a high level of ambition first. This is going to require both upstream and downstream policy measures that will focus on plastics that have high rates of leakage or are short-lived. And we recognize that this is not a problem that any one actor can address alone. We need government leadership, and with that leadership, business can deliver solutions.
Thank you so much, Jody. Really appreciate that. Jacob, wanted to jump over to you. I mean, Chris gave us a really detailed breakdown, but just taking into account everything that we're hearing from the rest of this panel, what do you think at EIA? What do you think the process and sequencing, and some of this might be recapping a little bit, is going to look like moving forward? When can we expect for the interventions to get thematic and more specific and more sensitive and maybe more contentious? Not maybe, definitely more contentious. At what point do you at EIA anticipate that coming to fruition?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Well, I think we heard from the very top from Ambassador Mesa-Quadra that the Secretariat has been instructed to produce this potential elements paper for INC2. So I think we can expect INC2 to really get more concretely into the elements of the agreement itself. And thus far, everything has been it's been important, but high level. And we had conversations about scope and objectives, but we really didn't get the chance to speak about these issues you're talking about, these contentious issues, the meat of what specific control measures and policy interventions will look like. And if we want to, thinking even further forward, get towards the goal of having draft text to work with by INC3, INC2 is going to be really critical to get to that treaty-making mode. And we need to have those substantive conversations on these elements. But very crucially, I think also we need to have conversations about the financing and other supporting requirements to ensure that can happen effectively. And that's what we'd call the means of implementation. These conversations need to happen early and in parallel, because if we're being frank, we could have the most ambitious treaty, with amazing provisions, but if we don't have equally ambitious means of implementation to build capacity and practically support the implementation, it won't be effective. So INC1 maybe suffered a little bit from some delegations only having one delegate per country, particularly developing states, which means that lower capacity governments literally can't be in more than one room at a time. So this has a real world impact in the progress of the meetings and having more than one contact group or informal group where these substantive conversations are happening. So that's why the conversations were happening a lot in plenary. So going forward into INC2 to have these substantive discussions, we're going to have to make sure that there's enough funding that the negotiations can meet the timetable. And this is relying on delegations to have more than one delegate, because if we're negotiating, what people are calling a great environmental treaty of our time, it's not enough to have one delegate from developing states that are impacted by these issues there to meaningfully contribute to the negotiations. So we'd expect that to happen at INC2, but for it to happen in a timely manner, this requires, it requires that funding. So I think that's what we'd expect to come and what we need to come as well.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Really appreciate that insight. John, can you come back on camera? Are you still there? I wanted to give you the final word as we move to close. And thanks everyone for your patience through this. John, I just one last question for you. What can you just share your feedback of like coming into this process? Like, what was this INC process like for you specifically, personally, flying to Uruguay and getting swept up into the middle of all this?
I think for me the whole process was very historic and very exciting, and I think not only for me but for very many speakers that got the news of some of the interactions we did in the INC. We are very hopeful because of the interactions that were there and all the learning that is there. I would say that it kindles our hopes for very many things. I was also excited by some of the resolutions that were being discussed there, because these are things that mean so much to us. And I believe that now we are more focused on, now because we already know these discussions that are happening on a global platform where there's a lot of modeling of policies and thoughts at the global level, but we're also very keen on having them implemented at the local level, so that it's not only like policies that are scientifically crafted and passed by it, but not or implemented well on the ground. So I think we are very much hopeful, and we took home that saying that we think globally and act locally. So we are also doing a lot of lobbying at the local level with very much hopes.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone, and thank you everyone for being a part of this today. We're incredibly grateful and humbled to be able to play a role in educating about the process. Just to give everyone a bit of context, we are going to distribute this conversation widely. We expect significant engagement and that it'll be really useful and really helpful to so many folks from so many different organizations all around the world. We're committed at the OPLN to continue to educate, to continue to surface alignment and agreement so that we can help play in whatever way possible a role in accelerating the process. And we really do believe that education is the key. So, on behalf of Marta and our entire team at the OPLN, we just want to say how grateful we are. We thank you so much for your patience and for staying with us today. And there will be so much more to come. And for those of you all around the world, as we move into a holiday season for many of us, we just want to wish you happy holidays. And thank you so much, everyone. Have an incredible rest of your day. And we'll be in touch soon.